Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Behaviorist Book Club. We're a community of busy behavior analysts trying to solve the problem of inconsistent and short-term positive client outcomes by providing behavior analysts with quick and easy access to evidence-based procedures, articles, and methods of behavior change. Welcome to an episode of One Less Lonely Practitioner, where we try to clarify and demystify some of the things that a BCBA goes through every single day. This episode of One Less Lonely Practitioner is going to be focusing a little bit more on the staff training and OBM side of our field. You know, we talk to a lot of practitioners, but a big part of what a BCBA does is actually training and educating staff, whether that be 30 minutes talking to a registered behavior technician or 2 weeks training a brand new direct care staff to implement their job with fidelity. It's kind of a long conversation, and we had a lot of fun. We talk about everything from severe behavior to direct practical ways that you can improve your staff training. So stay tuned in, and I'll talk to you guys right after. All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. How are you doing, Kaitlyn? Thanks for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Of course, Matt. I'm doing great. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing fantastic. We did have those audio issues, but we are good to go now.
We are good to go now. We might have already had a little bit of a conversation. I'm going to pretend that didn't happen.
That is the movie magic of the business. Let's start with where we started before we had to cut things off, which is my observation that in my experience, sometimes the friendships that you form with your coworkers when you work in severe behavior is those relationships are a little bit stronger than those you form with other coworkers. As someone who's worked in severe behavior a little bit longer than I have, do you find that to be true as well?
1000%. I've worked with severe behavior since 2013 for the most part. Only until recently in the past 6 months have I really switched gears. And I've definitively noticed a difference in sort of the relationships I have with my colleagues, in that we're not as bonded. Not that there isn't a bond that exists there, but there's always a unique bond when you work in severe behavior because you go from sometimes the trenches to something completely different on the other side. And I think when you have that 180 happen and you go through it with other people and you have that simultaneous experience, that it really brings people together.
Yeah, I found that sometimes I spend a lot of time thinking about those people who I met on, the intensive behavior unit, and I just wish that I could just like teleport them to my setting now because there's just undeniably a different type of bond formed. So when you were talking, it struck me that perhaps severe behavior needs a little bit of a definition. So in your experience, what separates perhaps a severe behavior case from a just standard behavior case, if you will?
Sure. So it's tricky. I don't think there's always a clear-cut definition. Just like we operationalize all of our definition for behaviors, I think there are some degrees that we can operationalize the definition for what is a truly severe behavior case. And I think what stands out for me is typically that they've exhausted their immediate resources, their regional resources, and it's reached a capacity where they need more intensive programming. That's not to say that maybe they've done all of those things, but the impact that their behavior has on themselves in terms of potentially injury, in terms of others, in terms of the home environment, if it's sort of that it's disrupted all of those different avenues, and they've, exhausted different levels of care, and need something more intensive like severe inpatient or intensive outpatient or lots of hours in the week, or mom and dad have to completely separate from the child because if they're present, problem behavior is going to happen and escalate to an unsafe level. 911 is being called. Those are sort of the situations that I think landed a lot of our individuals that we work together on the NBU with on our unit. And from being part of screening, those were sort of the things that we looked for. Have you really exhausted things? If you haven't, let's provide you with some more local resources so that we make sure we bring in those with the most need.
Okay. The NBU, for those who aren't aware, is the neurobehavior unit over at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, where I consider I got the majority of my training and where I met Kaitlyn, actually.
Yep, Matt and I were on the same team together. We were a dynamic trio, technically.
Trio, yeah.
But
Maybe we'll bring Courtney on the podcast and
she
she can
wasn't
round
on
it out.
very. She did podcasts with you.
Mm-hmm, yeah, those were never aired though. Those were some fun times. So in terms of, you mentioned that you were in severe behavior. Now you're in a different style of position. So I'm leading up to another question, but what's your current job position now?
Sure. So I don't think my actual position name really stands to mean much, but also I'm the training and outreach support manager. So I work directly with my organization's director of training, in sort of a quality assurance, organizational behavior management, training of direct care and supervisory staff, position. So I have an array of responsibilities that are completely separate from clinical, which is what I'm used to, where I'm responsible for all of the training of our entry level staff. So I spend a week with staff as they come in to train them on autism spectrum disorder, because my current organization specifically serves only those with an autism diagnosis. So I do training on, autism, applied behavior analysis, teaching strategies, how to identify functions of problem behavior, really trying to instill clinical judgment as best I can. And then our crisis management training as well. And then I also have an outreach support role. So we have an outreach department to serve those who are on wait lists for our services, who can't get access to other services in our area. And I do external consultation, external trainings for school districts, companies, etc.
Wow, that's quite a tall order in terms of job responsibilities.
It is. I will say that my role in outreach is much smaller, because we have a department of other people who can assist with outreach, but I do some work there, but a majority of my responsibility definitely falls under training, especially with our crisis management curriculum, since it has intensive yearly requirements and recertification for obvious safety reasons.
So do you have a caseload now, or are you out of the clinical realm?
I'm completely out of the clinical realm, and I think
Wow.
who knows me really well, that's probably a complete shock.
Yeah, and I also want to point out to all the BCBAs who are maybe feeling burnt out or are thinking like all I can do with a BCBA is clinical work. I think there are definitely other options. So was it a hard transition to go from a clinical role to this OBM style position?
Yeah. I actually don't think it was a difficult transition, because I think over the years that I've had experience with severe behavior, obviously I've gotten to know more from the operations side as well, because those two things interrelate in significant ways. And I think some of my greatest joys and greatest frustrations have come from sort of the dichotomy or harmony between operations side of things and clinical implementation. So it's cool to come to this new role where I have the ability to make or participate in interventions that result in socially significant change for those who deliver our services versus those who receive our services. Because obviously, if I'm able to better train our staff to provide quality services, it's going to have an impact on those that we serve as well. So I tried to frame my mindset that while I'm not clinical and having a direct caseload, I do kind of have caseloads as they come in. I'm training different individuals. I'm trying to find effective interventions for training, and we're constantly evolving our training based on the training groups that come in. So I think I tried to lie to myself because I knew it was going to be a little hard for me. And I was like, just think about it as clinical in a different way. And I also have a supervisee who's working toward their BCBA. So in some degree, I get to continue to have those clinical conversations. I interact very closely with our clinical team. So I think it's a unique thing that's actually I found a lot of joy in and think might be my chosen field within, or my chosen specialty within ABA,
Wow.
because it evokes such change that I think is really critical.
Huh. Well, I have 100 follow-up questions, because this wasn't the direction I thought this interview was going to take. But in my position as a clinic manager, I've felt myself shift more and more, and I fought against it a little bit, and I hang on to a couple of my cases, but I find myself more and more into the training and development role. So my first question is, well, just let everybody know where you're located, because I think that's relevant.
Sure. I'm located in New Jersey, which, if you tell already, has the densest population of individuals with autism. So there's a lot of services in our area, but we're still overwhelmed because there's also many individuals who need services.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So are you somebody who hires? And if you are you having struggles with attracting applicants?
I'm not
with the labor shortage.
I'm not involved directly in recruiting and hiring,
Okay.
but I would say that their interview extends into our training. So yes, you've been hired, but I do get to evaluate you as you come in and see if you're an appropriate fit for the organization, but they get in the door without me.
Okay.
And I will say, just because I do interact closely with our recruitment, that we are in general having trouble getting people in the door. There's definitely a staff shortage nationwide as far as I'm aware. So staffing has been really tough, especially with the recent surge in COVID cases. And because where I work, we provide a wide array of programming. So we have day services, school services, residential services, and in-home services. So it's a medium-sized organization, but there's still a lot of working parts that has definitely thrown a wrench in. So it's been difficult.
Yeah, I was on Facebook today, and I saw a job notice from New England Center for Kids, and they were offering a $10,000 signing bonus for an entry-level teacher, which is essentially a behavior tech, an RBT style position. And I was blown away at $10,000. And I'm sure there's strings attached, but that's the kind of recruitment that people are having to resort to. It's wild. I'm not sure what Kennedy is doing, if they're doing anything like that, but at least at our clinic, we currently don't have anything like that. But maybe it's something that a lot of clinic directors need to consider in a time like this.
Our organization is offering sign-on bonuses, not $10,000, but we are offering sign-on bonuses, referral bonuses, and we also have wage increases that are temporary.
I haven't heard that before yet.
Because we have a surge in COVID. So we're trying to, reflect that there is a expanded risk of working with individuals who either have been exposed to or do have COVID, but it's a service that we need because we're providing residential services and there's no other way around it. We have to give the care.
So in terms of training, because I want to shift now, you have them in training. It sounds like you do a week of intensive style training. Is that you with them 9 to 5, or is that you training them and then sending them to shadow? What does that look like?
So our current way that it's set up is a 5-day, 8-hour day with an hour lunch. So I guess a 7-hour day. Typically they have an hour lunch. Our first 2 days are really sort of more lecture and BST with embedded activities, behavior skills training. So a lot of instructing, modeling, rehearsal, immediate feedback about a variety of different teaching strategies, how to respond to problem behavior, things along that line. And then the last 3 days is our physical management crisis intervention curriculum. So it's more chapter work as well, along with a lot of hands-on training and repetition. and we embed resistance training at the end. So they learn how to respond to a behavioral crisis from start to finish, including identifying the antecedent, identifying what the appropriate way to respond is based on what their history of function might be or based on that immediate scenario. I do, and I know what you're leading to, very much so wish that we had the capacity to, or we probably do have the capacity, we just haven't found a way to do it yet, to embed more on the site, on the job training, or at least observation. Some of our staff are able to observe the week prior in the location that they'll work in. Some are not. And so I worry often that, we throw so much information at them, and then sort of, hope that it sticks. So we're currently developing a lot of follow-up competency assessments, where we'll do 30, 60, and 90-day checks on all of the critical skills that we think are most important to being a direct care staff.
Okay.
Things like active engagement, prompting, knowing how to use training and task analysis procedures, responding appropriately to problem behavior. So we're in a sort of pivotal place where we're making a lot of changes in the organization due to a lot of movement and sort of upper management. And so I'm optimistic to see where this goes, because two behavior analysts working together trying to change sort of a lot of things, but doing it in a slow, systematic manner and making sure that, we're using best practice procedures.
Mhm. So you mentioned behavioral skills training. So it's role play with the direct feedback. Do you do any video modeling, or have you experimented with other kind of time leveraged ways of delivering training versus lecture?
Yeah, absolutely. So, or not necessarily versus lecture, but sort of embedded. I guess when I say
True.
lecture, I mean, we have a presentation going on, but as the presentation's happening, we're inserting activities. So it's not just talking at people. And we also have, active student responding in there. We do fill in the blanks in our presentation to keep individuals actively engaged throughout, discussion questions. But when it comes to utilizing BST, anytime we sort of broach on something that's a pivotal part of the performance of the job, we typically have a video model. Then we have an in-person model that me and my direct supervisor will do. And then we'll have each person perform that skill either in groups together, dyads, triads, or if we have a smaller group, which has been happening because of COVID, we'll actually do one-on-one because we have that ability to provide that more detailed, specific training.
I was going to ask, is it how big are your groups that you've been training lately? Is it smaller?
It's been variable. We have had some extremely small groups. So we've had a group that was 2 people, which is 2 of us as trainers training 2 people. Weird dynamic. But I would say that me and my supervisor, we get along really well. And I think we have fun with our training groups. That's the feedback that we get. We get a lot of good feedback.
So you do take feedback from
yes.
so at what, how specific is the feedback? Is it, I liked this intervention, like I liked the ASRs, but not the discussion questions, or is it more general, like I felt like I'm prepared?
It's more general in relation to the job. So it's an HR form that's completed of the training. But we also just solicit verbal feedback, since sometimes we don't get as much feedback from those forms as we would like. And a lot of times we don't even need to solicit feedback, and people will come to us because they're there the following week as well for training. We're just not the ones conducting that training. It's more things necessary for adult services through the Department of Developmental Disabilities, and like administrative stuff like benefits, etc. So they'll come back and say, wow, like I feel like I learned so much that week. Thank you so much. And they're always open to come visit us for questions or shoot us an email. So I like to think we do a good job at rapport building. But I think we could add a little behavior analytic pizzazz to the way that we're collecting data on feedback. I always think within our entire organization, I just am always seeking to do things better. and more efficiently, and that has purpose and meaning and yields data-driven objective information.
Is everybody that you deal with in your organization, I'm thinking in terms of your management, are they all behavior analytic in the way that they think?
That is a great question. And the answer to that question is, I guess, a blanket no.
So then my follow-up question, because I had a feeling, was as someone who I know is a radical behaviorist, if you will, how do you find that you have to change certain aspects of your language or change different presentation styles so that you can communicate to people who haven't drank the Kool-Aid?
That's a good way of putting it. I think my experiences over the past, how long I've been doing this since 2013, so 8 years, have evolved completely in the way that I interact with others who don't have, a certification in behavior analysis or even any, advanced training in behavior analysis. Maybe they just did our entry level training and that's really what they know. And of course that information fades with time. So I think I've really learned to adapt to who I'm talking to. If I know that I'm speaking with another behavior analyst or someone who has a great deal of knowledge in behavior analysis, I want to speak with conceptually systematic language as best I can. I'm trying to use it, not lose it.
Love that.
I've lost it since I passed the exam a little less than 2 years ago because I'm still a newly minted behavior analyst. But I do find it easy to talk with other staff in a way that uses our concepts without using the terminology. So I try and break things down into very clear examples. I saw a TED Talk that I thought really helped make the BST model better. And it's the SBI model. So you talk about the situation, the behavior, and the impact. You explain first you ask, is it okay if I provide some feedback? Because I think asking for consent to deliver feedback sets the tone much more positively than it is someone just coming in and giving you feedback right away. And then you talk about the context in which the problem occurred, what the behavior was that needs feedback, and the impact that it had. Because I think if we don't describe the purpose and the rationale to why you need to deliver that feedback, it doesn't result in long-term behavior change. It might result in temporary change in the moment. It might go on for a couple of weeks, but then maybe there's a little drift and they'll forget sort of the reasoning behind it. So I'm often trying as best I can to give staff, clear examples that aid in their clinical decision making. But I also recognize that it took me years to build up my own clinical decision making. So it's not something that happens overnight. So we need to deliver not just our entry level training, but ongoing trainings that refresh individuals on these concepts, and that we deliver feedback often, both in the positive manner as well as constructive, because it can be easy to become an stimulant. And that's something I avoid significantly in my career because I think as a younger, not yet certified behavior analyst, just really entering the field, I didn't quite conceptualize things in the way that I do now, because now I'm focused on function. Is it socially significant? Is what I'm going to be able to generalize? Whereas as an early person interested in the field, I was like, wow, it's so cool that you can change behavior, necessarily understand the ethics and the implications. And I think there were some missteps earlier in my very beginning of my career out of college, working as a teaching assistant and one-to-one aide in a classroom, that I look back now and I'm a little cringe about.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I could cry at some of the stuff that I used to do as an RBT back in the day, and I thought that it was great. And I really I thought that I was making a difference, and I was, but not the kind of difference that you'd want to make. As you were going through, I, I think it's really interesting you point that out, because I don't know if other people feel it, but I feel like every week and a half, I feel like I grow as a behavior analyst and my mindset shifts. Like, I can tell you in the last 3 months, I know I've become a more ethically conscious, trauma assumed, citing Dr. Hanley, trauma assumed behavior analyst, just by reading and listening and learning. So I guess what I'm saying is, did you kind of see a point where that shifted for you, or is it only upon reflection that you can see your own shift?
I think there was a pivotal point that I noticed a shift, and I think it was when I first stopped working at Kennedy Krieger and entered my first official role as a behavior analyst at another organization. And I was sort of struck by, Kennedy Krieger. We have so many resources. We have so many great minds there. And we're able to do a lot that a lot of other organizations don't have the ability to do. So that was a culture shock to start. But then I think you see how people do things differently. And you start to question, was the way I was doing it before the most ethical, socially acceptable, evidence-based way of doing it? And I found myself questioning things that I probably would have defended significantly in the past.
Yeah.
And I think what I've decided to do overall as a behavior analyst is to listen, accept others, opinions, try to see them from their perspective, and then build my opinion from there, not respond immediately, not be defensive. Because I think our field has so much to learn and to grow toward. And some of the things that I think we are alluding to, the reputation of behavior analysts sometimes is my way or the highway, not easy to collaborate with. And I've 100% seen that in my experience over the past 8 years. And I think that I've learned as much from those who I maybe didn't admire some of their behavior so much as I did those who I really aspired to be like. I think you learn from your own mistakes, the missteps of others, and the good things that you see or read or are able to observe. And I've really tried to internalize those things to become a better behavior analyst. And I feel the same way, that I feel like I'm constantly growing, constantly evolving. And I think that's the best possible sign that you're doing things in the right direction, because imposter syndrome is real.
Yeah.
I find myself that I am trying to better myself as a behavior analyst, stay on top of the current literature, and do things that make a meaningful impact.
How do you, speaking to imposter syndrome a little bit, but also into this constant growth in humility, because I think humility is a big part of it, accepting the fact that you don't know everything. But I also think too, that same accepting that you don't know everything, there's so much more to learn. I think that also somewhat leads to imposter syndrome, which also is negative. So do you think there's where's that balance of being humble enough to learn, but being confident enough to do your job in the best way you can and avoid imposter syndrome?
It's a delicate line, because I sometimes go back and forth. I sometimes find myself thinking I'm appearing too confident, or I think sometimes I just feel like a little too confident and I need to take a step back. And there are other times that I feel completely out of place and I'm like, why don't I know this? But I think instead of leaning into those feelings, I'm like, okay, how can I turn this into a teachable moment?
Do you feel like you're a position where you kind of you've always been somebody who's proficient at giving feedback. I know that from experience, because you've shaped a lot of my behavior in a very positive way. But
That's
do you but do you feel that that being thrust into a position that you're in now, where your job is essentially giving effective feedback. Like at its core, you need to give feedback. Do you think that's helped you get over this imposter syndrome or made it more significant?
I think it's helped. I think I actually felt imposter syndrome a bit more in my clinical role, not because necessarily because I didn't think I knew how to assess behavior, treat behavior, provide comprehensive care overall, but because I didn't know how to effectively manage my time when there were so many other issues that needed to be resolved. So I think that's where my imposter syndrome came from, that I felt like I wasn't doing enough.
That's wild. Time management is literally the biggest place where my imposter syndrome pops out. Tell me about the time management thing. Expand on that a little bit more.
Sure. So at this previous role that I worked in, I managed a 5-person caseload, which to other people, they would be like, that's a dream. People, that sounds amazing. And now in retrospect, knowing some of the caseloads of my fellow behavior analysts, it was pretty dreamy. I will say, however, that those individuals required an intensive level of care. And because there was such a dichotomy between operations and clinical, as well as all of our other services, so speech and language, OT, PT, etc., that I really felt like there wasn't harmony, and that, we would work very hard to identify the function of problem behavior, develop these function-based plans, but we didn't have consistent delivery, consistent implementation of those plans to see significant treatment effects that generalized, to the main living unit that they were on. And we had these work groups to come together with solutions, but, the COVID-19 pandemic has also played a significant role on the delivery of these services, because sometimes we're just grappling to have enough staff to work with individuals. So how can I really expect someone who is working with 3 individuals who have intensive behavior plans to really implement all of those things with fidelity? So I was extremely sympathetic to that, as well as to those who are overseeing those shifts, because it was 1 to 2 people for a lot of individuals. It wasn't manageable. So I go back and I think, how can I be upset at something where they don't have adequate resources? Some people don't even have the prerequisite skills. So instead of looking at it as, I'm going to give a ton of feedback, you're not doing this, you're not doing that, which is not the way I approach feedback to listeners, just, talking about how sometimes people approach giving feedback. I want it to be something positive for the staff. How can I help you? How can I make this easier? Let's change the plan so it's something that's feasible for you to implement, that still increases their adaptive functioning and reduces their challenging behavior. So I think the time management, getting back to that, I just felt overwhelmed because I didn't have all the time to make all of those things happen.
Yeah.
So it felt like a broken record that I was trying so desperately to make play. And I wasn't contacting reinforcement, and I don't think staff were either. We were all in survival mode. And
I think that's a really important note too, with I've heard the broken record type metaphor a lot, where you feel like you're just chasing that, like something happens and you put out the fire, something else happens, you put out the fire. And there's really not a lot of reinforcement in that. There's not a lot of like, look and see the good change I made, because while the good change is occurring, you're putting out another fire. So I think it's an interesting maybe piece of advice for the new behavior analyst is, sometimes even if something like absolutely needs to get done, maybe take like 15 minutes and look at what you've done in the past and hopefully see some of the success maybe.
Absolutely. I think setting boundaries, because it can be really easy in our field to experience compassion fatigue.
Yes.
That if you have the mindset, which I did, of I'm not doing enough, and then I try and make up for that in some capacity, I would have, burnt out much sooner than I wound up burning out. Because I did set boundaries for myself. I'm leaving by this time daily. I'm not getting earlier than this. I'm going to eat lunch every day.
Lunch was the big. I didn't eat lunch for the first 4 months of my new job. I still sometimes don't eat lunch. It's lunch is a big one for me.
Eating lunch. It's important. At a specific time. Make it a routine. Antecedent management. Proactive strategies. But I think time management is something that is a constant work if you're in a clinical setting or in, a clinic manager role like you are. So I almost feel like I've been gifted with this current position because my time is being used to hopefully make systems that help out people in positions like you, other behavior analysts, so that overall we're able to provide effective, efficient services while still maintaining the essence of what behavior analysis is, which is that it's a science, which is what I love so much about ABA.
I love this take on time management of it. I think a lot of times when you talk to somebody about time management, they're like, buy this planner and then, use sticky notes and do this. But what you're really referring to is a mindset shift. Time management is almost like a personality change, right?
Absolutely. I can get fuzzy. My master's is in clinical psychology, so my initial background comes from psychology and where, behavior analysis, we tend to focus on overt behaviors rather than covert behaviors. And I think there's so much opportunity in our field to grow, to expand our application, which it has. It's just not the primary delivery that's happening. A lot of people are working with individuals with disabilities, but we have a role in the criminal justice system, in sustainability and climate change, and just how different businesses operate. And it'd be cool to see, more diversity in the roles and that it becomes more of a norm to work in different areas.
Yeah, I totally agree. Here's an interesting question. When you're training staff in terms of overt and covert behaviors, what do you feel like presents the more significant behavioral barrier to them becoming solid direct care staff? Does that make sense? Like an overt behavior, if them not attending or something, but a covert behavior perhaps being internal verbal dialogue, contradicting what's being lectured. Do you see what I'm trying to get at?
I see.
What is more challenging to overcome as a trainer, the overt or the covert?
That's a tough one because I think I'm such a person that's I individualize. It's based on the individual. So I think I don't necessarily know some of the covert behavior. Yes, there can be some overt behavior indicators that I could say, that's might be a manifestation of anxiety, things along that line. And usually I'm pretty attuned to things like that. But I actually feel like I don't know that I really struggle. No, that I do struggle because you don't know how someone best responds to those things. I know if I'm teaching physical procedures or a way to do things procedurally, I have steps to reference back to. Yes, some clinical judgments inserted in there, a lot of clinical judgments inserted in there, but that's something I can more easily define a response to. Whereas with those covert behaviors, I sort of fall to what's been helpful for me and not necessarily for the other person. So I try to remind myself to listen if they want to share, to make accommodations wherever I can for those who ask for them within reasonable terms, and to help them feel comfortable. I try to do a lot of antecedent management. I think me and my supervisor do that really well with making them feel comfortable in the environment because we know at the end of the week they're going to have to take this test for our physical management curriculum. That can be a source of anxiety for a lot of people because it's tied to employment. So we work really hard to make them feel comfortable, make them feel over-prepared, give them lots of tools and resources so that hopefully we can minimize those covert behaviors that might impact their overt behavior.
That's interesting. So you observe and target the overt behaviors with behavioral skills training, significant definitions, modeling, role play, what we know and love. But then antecedent management seems to be the primary strategy for the covert behaviors.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah.
I will say what's unique to my role that I haven't really had much experience with before is that I'm working with a lot of English language learners,
Interesting.
and a lot of the behavioral terminology and language isn't
Yeah.
something that translates. So I'm having to find unique ways to explain things, simplify things if they need to until they really understand it, and hopefully are able to give me an example themselves. But that's been an interesting area of work where I've actually had to reach out to colleagues to ask for advice, because a lot of the different interventions we've tried, while, have had some level of therapeutic effect, we're still seeing individuals who I think will be such great staff, who can't perform on necessary parts of the job that are out of my control, unfortunately. And there's other people who can just memorize to get what they've done, and then it goes out the window. So I'm always looking for intrinsic motivation in staff, that they seem excited to be there, that they're intrigued by the information, that they get excited in, those role play situations. So I think there's a lot to be said about covert behavior and more room for the field to grow to look into those things in a behavior analytic way.
A lot of BCBAs who are out there, myself, when I'm put on my clinical supervisor hat included, in terms of training, what we use is that, like, we're in the session room with the kid, we're working with a registered behavior technician, and we've written up a protocol, and we have 1 hour to make sure that RBT can implement that procedure for the rest of the 6-hour session. So for those analysts, with your experience as a trainer, what is the key points of feedback or BST that you would communicate so that we can train most efficiently, as speedily as possible, but still accurate?
I'm trying to grasp around your question because you brought up a lot of great points that had me thinking about other things. So you're asking me what's essentially my best advice for BST?
Not just BST, but like you mentioned SBI, which I'd never heard of, and I think it's a fascinating method of feedback. But like, so much of a BCBA's job is condensed down into short little snippets. I have 30 minutes with this kid before I have to go meet with a parent. So in terms of that, like, 30-minute training session with the RBT, like, what would be your suggestion on getting that RBT competent in the skill?
I think scenario-based BST is the best. So yes, I can have you demonstrate use of backward chaining with me for hand washing. I can have you model active engagement with me. I can ask you, here's this ABC chart, and what would you identify as the potential function or functions? But I think giving the most realistic scenarios that they're likely to encounter on the job, especially if you're training directly with an individual or set of individuals where you can really give them that meaningful exposure to scenarios they're likely to encounter, is most likely to have the most meaningful impact. So I think
That makes sense.
Yeah, applying that to BST, because I found that that's what has been most helpful in instilling clinical judgment beyond just protocol driven behavior.
I So protocol-driven behavior versus clinical judgment. That's a really interesting distinction. What do you, where's that line? Like, can you expand on the difference between somebody following a protocol and using their clinical judgment?
Sure. It's not that the two can't overlap. So I want to be distinct about that because someone can be protocol driven and also have good clinical judgment. But I have also found that someone can be protocol driven and have minimal to no clinical judgment of how to respond to scenarios that aren't explicitly written in the individual behavior plan or other support plans or, snippets of information that you get from staff. So I think being protocol driven is being very rigid to what's written, hopefully at the very, because we know that sometimes that doesn't even exist. Sometimes not to their fault. Other times, we need to better train, etc. So I think you can be protocol driven where you know what's on the paper and are able to do that. But then if a scenario pops up where you're challenged because there's no direct answer on the paper, that you need to either have had observation with feedback or experience with feedback that's been able to shape your behavior such that you know how to respond appropriately to scenarios that there's no specific protocol for.
Yeah. So it comes down, like, the best way to, it comes down to experience in a way, like experience plus feedback.
Yeah, I'm sure it's much more layered than that if I were to delve into my own thoughts now. But I think those are the two things that shaped my clinical judgment most were experience and feedback. Of course, with knowing.
I would agree. Yeah. It just strikes me that while I think that's the most common way to get clinical judgment, I also would probably argue that's the least efficient, right? That's the least time leveraged option. Like, I don't know how it would be difficult for me to take somebody, like in my position, the RBTs have to complete their 40-hour course. So that usually takes about 2 weeks or so at our clinic. So I at least get 2 weeks with them where they're not directly implementing protocols yet. And I'm trying to think of where I can shove that clinical judgment in there. I don't know. I'm not sure how you would form clinical judgment without experience. It makes me think of like matrix training and, intensive skill acquisition style things with multiple exemplar training and scenario based instructions. I don't know where we would really be able to form that.
I think that's honestly what I'm finding toughest in the field, because now in this training position where I'm looking to find ways to make training most effective and meaningful and result in well-trained staff who are able to perform a wide variety of skills, I don't think I've seen it really done perfectly anywhere, or at least done is generalizable to a wide array of locations. Different settings with, different number of staff, different services. So I think what I have found or what I'd like to instill in the organization I'm currently working in is having mentors.
Okay.
So oftentimes those who are in roles to oversee staff are already overwhelmed by the tasks that they have to complete, such that they're not able to provide that necessary feedback, consistent consequences, reinforcement for appropriate behaviors. And by appropriate, I feel like I'm always wording things in a behavior, like behavioral way, like I would with, my clinical work. So making sure, we're seeing, appropriate behavior from staff versus inappropriate behavior. Sorry, that was my cat. Linus says hello.
Linus.
But if they have someone who has been proficient in the job, has the hands-on experience with the individuals that they're working with, has all the experience in the different strategies that they're need and interventions that they're going to need to use, sort of in the way that the NBU had, trainers who would watch individuals on the job and provide, shadowing and then reverse shadowing. The question of time, coming back to time.
Yeah, it's that time.
It's tough.
I found reverse shadowing is really effective. Like a fade from shadowing to reverse shadowing is probably, in my opinion, the part of our training that produces the most behavior change. But it is also the most time intensive.
Yeah.
Like you said.
Organization perspective, it's costly.
Mm-hmm.
When they're not in a training capacity, what's their other role? I feel like all of my solutions are dollar bills. I'm like, we need to add this in, we need to extend training, we need to add this model. So I'm constantly thinking back to our principles. How do we have that parsimony? How do we have it be the simplest solution to get us the meaningful outcome? And I don't have an answer for that just yet, but I'm sure as hell going to keep working on it and get back to you. I think that is where our ABA needs to focus just as intensely on the services we provide directly to individuals, how we're using it within our organization. I feel like times those who are delivering the services, the same principles aren't being applied consistently. And so I think it's really critical that we look to add more roles in that area to make change.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point right there, just the addition of roles. Because like I'm the primary trainer at my job in terms of the registered behavior techs. Like I do nearly all of the training, but I also have another 5 hats that I have to wear that same day. So it's not uncommon for me to have to interrupt a training session to go put out a fire somewhere else. And it creates it's a difficult time intensive position. And some places it's that dollar bills. That maybe they can't afford another trainer, or maybe it's a difficult issue. There was a article published in this most recent issue of Java 54, and it was actually, I think, the last one that I podcasted about in Java. So plug to myself on my own podcast.
I'll be listening to it after this. Well, not tonight because I go to sleep early. But
So it's by Romer and colleagues, and it talks about the observational effect in learning. And it's really interesting because what they did is they took people who had never experienced discrete trial training and they watched videos. And while they were watching, they actually rated and scored the behavior of the therapist. And after rating and scoring the video model, they then popped in and actually did the DTT. Okay. And what they found was that it seemed like the rating of the therapist produced enough active responding, enough differential observational learning that their behaviors increased immediately to accurate responding. It was an incredible study, and it showed pretty cleanly through a multiple baseline design that I'm pulling up the graphs now. It was 0 to 40% on baseline, and then immediately up to 100. And it was based on this, not just the observation, but rating of another staff member.
My brain is churning because
that's what I felt like when I read this. And their point, not to interrupt you, their point on this article was specifically how to deal with low trainer to trainee ratios. What do you do when there's one trainer and 15 new staff to be trained, and that trainer has to go be a BCBA for a couple hours?
I'm so glad you told me about that article, because I'm going to be bringing that up first thing Monday morning, because another portion of my role, which is a weird portion of my role, is that I'm a backup American Red Cross trainer. So I also occasionally fill in to train staff on how to respond to breathing and cardiac emergencies. And administer epinephrine injectors and all of that. And part of my training to be an instructor for that included that. And I can't believe I didn't take that note because I remember thinking, I think that was really effective. I noticed that by having, sort of ratings of other staff that were they shared in the article, would they share their feedback prior to demonstrating it?
So it was essentially a Qualtrics survey style thing where they showed the video and then if I remember right, something would pop up and say, was this implemented correctly? Yes or no? And if they said yes and it was correct, they would say, you're right. This is why. And then if it was incorrect, they would say, nope, this is the correct answer and why. So it was like, it was that immediate feedback too.
I love this so much, and I'm going to immediately make some changes to our training based on this article because I can see how that's so beneficial. We do sort of embed that. We present data sheets where we have filled in data and we ask them to identify what was done correctly versus where was there an error. And I feel like that's helped tremendously with our data collection portion.
I love that idea. Yeah.
Be applied to other aspects of our training. So that's super cool. Send training articles that you see anytime.
It was this article was the last article I covered in that volume, and it was probably the one that made me change my behavior the most because I was just like, oh my gosh, this is yeah. At our clinic, we've started to develop checklists, but we're at the point where we have the checklist ready, but we're not sure if I'm not sure if I want to apply it to have shadowing RBTs, observing live RBTs, which I think would maybe be uncomfortable for those people because you're essentially rating the live RBT, or do it over the video. So
this was something that in my role as a behavior analyst, my last clinical role, that we had challenges with because we needed to conduct fidelity checks. And even though we had the ability to monitor via camera, you can't see everything that's happening in order to accurately be able to determine their fidelity to the implementation of the plan. So we worked really hard to make treatment integrity fidelity checks be a positive thing for staff. We added in reinforcement contingencies, both for us as those who administer them, as well as for staff. And we did see a shift over time, that they were perceived more positively by staff. Of course, we didn't actually collect formal data on that. That would have been cool. But from just anecdotal discussion amongst staff, we saw general improvement in how they felt about these integrities being conducted. But I do think it's a difficult thing because there's obviously effects to being observed. It comes back to a lot of those covert behaviors. And impacts they have on overt behavior. So you manage those things to make sure you're actually getting an accurate reflection of their ability to perform that skill.
And I think the covert behaviors, that internal monologue of, they don't trust me. They don't watch somebody else as much as they watch me, or, I hope I did this right, or, just the general discomfort of having quote unquote big brother observing you. I think these are all real challenges to making fidelity checks happen. I think your reinforcement contingencies are powerful in that sense. I also think like that cultural shift, to get a little fuzzy myself, like this sense of shifting the expectation away from, this fidelity check is happening to, I'm just going into work and this is what happens every day and it's just a reality, but a positive reality, not like a negative one.
Yeah, sometimes you have to flip the narrative. I'm big on mindset. So if you're able to tell staff, hey, this is something I'm conducting to be able to make sure that the plan that we've developed is something that's feasible for you to implement. Is there anything I can get for you before we get started? Do you need any concept or procedure explained to you, modeled for you, rehearsed for you?
It strikes me that your SBI acronym it was, what did the S stand for again?
Situation, behavior.
Yeah.
Look up the
So
TED Talk, and I have to shout out a fellow behavior analyst for sharing it with me. So shout out to Perez, who I worked with in the previous role, because she introduced it to me, and I was like, this is genius.
Yeah, but that impact portion at the end, I think might be powerful for fidelity too. You know, like, why am I taking fidelity data? Well, there's a significant impact to this child's life if fidelity is off. In one sense, they could have behaviors and it could harm them. In another sense, I could be making completely wrong decisions as a behavior analyst and sending this kid on a wild goose chase because I'm not sure what's really going on during the session.
Absolutely. I think the more we can actually do that on the front end, the more powerful the benefit will be. I've always found it really important to include sort of purpose and rationale, different plan components, and to make the plans readable, digestible.
Oh, yeah.
There's so much we can do on the antecedent end to make the lives of those that are implementing those things easier, and for us as those that are checking the fidelity of them and sometimes implementing them ourselves. So I think the more we look at things from a solution-based standpoint rather than why aren't they doing this or why aren't they doing that, how can we make it easier? How can we make it more simple? How can I make it more likely that I'm going to see the target behavior?
Yeah, I totally agree. As soon as you look at the tech, in my case, the RBT, or in your case, the direct care staff, as soon as you look at that individual and say, why aren't you doing this? You've lost. You know, you've totally lost the whole game. You have to take that humility, which we talked about before, take that humility and say, the environment, myself included, is not being set up in a way to promote this behavior. You know, I shouldn't have to force this behavior. It should be occurring based on already prevailing contingencies. So how can I arrange the environment to promote what needs to be seen for the kid? It's, yeah.
Behavior analysis is so cool.
It
I
is. It is.
think that some behavior analysts are still coming around, and we're constantly evolving too, but I think there was a pivotal moment when my mind shifted more towards the direction of embracing that humility that you've been talking about and coming at things from a behavior analytic perspective and sort of separating sometimes the emotionally charged portion of it, which is, you know, people's sometimes tendency to deliver, you know, statements of concern that result in being sort of an aversive stimulus. I want to avoid at all costs being an aversive stimulus because it change behavior if it's that way. I need to build rapport. I need to have a positive relationship. And that all starts with me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I learned the humility portion. I first learned it in relation to the clients I worked with. And then I learned it with the professionals I worked with. Like, I can point out the case where I learned for a fact that I was not smart enough to know everything. Like I literally could see that there was a behavioral impact and I could not fix it. Like I'll never forget the kid.
Is it a friend that I know?
It's not that one. But you do know them. And so I remember that distinctly.
Talking about, but we'll have to talk about
I remember that distinctly, and it crushed me. But it made me realize that I can read every article in the world, and I'm not going to be smart enough to fix everything. But I didn't get that with the professionals until much later, and I can't really pinpoint what pivoted with the professionals. I can't pinpoint that as easily. But there was definitely a point where I shifted into a more humble role, working with other professionals in the field. And honestly, I'm not really sure, because I was a pretty cocky behavior analyst for a while. Like, I was pretty arrogant. And I think there are some benefits that come to that, but there's a lot of negatives that I didn't realize at the time.
I think we both have that same experience, and I think I'm still recovering from that some of the time. And I really try and be mindful of that because I'll hear voices in my head, and I'm like, no, Kaitlyn, think about it. And I found found that really beneficial. But so much of what we do isn't necessarily changing the behavior of the individual. It's teaching them skills. We're, trying to deficit. And a lot of the other stuff is changing our own behavior. And I think it takes a long time for those that are implementing to see that. They think about it in a manner of control, that my behavior will change your behavior, but through my words and certain actions, but not necessarily through other minor, simple changes that you just make that reduce a lot of challenging behavior and allow them to more readily access skills that we should be teaching them. There needs to be a bigger focus on teaching skills more than it is reducing challenging behavior, because if you teach skills, you're going to see hopefully a simultaneous decrease in that challenging behavior. And
the lovely reality of the matching law.
We love the matching law.
Love it.
But I think oftentimes when you have these entry-level staff or inexperienced staff, or even someone who's come out of a 40-hour training to be an RBT and done a competency assessment and passed the exam, none of that really comes together until you have those moments. I think I would have gotten there a lot more quickly if I knew or had someone deliver the feedback that I think I'm building in my own repertoire now. So hopefully I can be that for other people. That's why I love having a supervisor. I feel like I'm able to talk about my errors and understand those things, and hopefully it'll make an impact on her as a future behavior analyst.
I can't think of a better place to end the interview right there. I usually ask what actionable advice you have, but I think you just dropped the mic on it right then and there, Kaitlyn.
I had such a way with words. I guess we really did rock the show.
Rock the show, indeed. All right. Thank you for hanging out with me, and I will talk to everyone in a couple seconds.
All right. Thank you, Matt.
All right, everybody. That was the interview with Kaitlyn. I hope you could tell, but we had a blast recording it. It was a lot of fun to kind of chat through all the different scenarios that she is faced with every single day, as well as the different procedures that she uses as somebody in that position to establish efficient and effective behavior change among staff. Sometimes a week that she has to train may feel like a luxury, but when you compare it to the vast amount of things that she needs to communicate and that these direct care staff need to be able to implement correctly, you feel like you're running out of time very fast. That is our Wednesday episode, and we will be continuing to talk about ABA research in Friday's episode, and we're going to be going over metaphysics and natural philosophy. Kind of an interesting topic, but I think everyone will find it very useful. So I will see you guys then. And remember, you can always find me and more of my show notes and things like that at my website, behavioristbookclub.com, my Facebook page, The Behaviorist Book Club, and my Facebook group, ABA Daily Research Share, where we share daily research articles as well as updates about this podcast. Thank you all for listening, and I will talk to y'all soon.